The year is 1941, and somewhere in a small classroom in occupied Poland, a woman stands in front of a chalkboard covered in carefully drawn maps. Her name is Anna Pawlik, and to the German soldiers sitting before her, she is nothing more than a local teacher pressed into service to help the Wehrmacht navigate the treacherous terrain of the Eastern Front. They see her as useful, compliant, perhaps even grateful for the opportunity to avoid harsher labor. What they don't see is that every line she draws, every landmark she identifies, every distance she marks, is a carefully constructed lie. This isn't a story about guns or bombs. This is a story about a woman who turned geography into a weapon, and in doing so, she may have altered the course of entire military operations without firing a single shot. By the time the Germans realized what she had done, hundreds of their men were already lost in the forests, their convoys stuck in impassable roads that their maps promised were highways, their supply lines severed because they trusted the woman who smiled politely and pointed to the wrong river. Poland in 1941 was a nation erased from the map, carved up between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union like a carcass between wolves. The Germans had swept through the country 2 years earlier with a speed and brutality that left the world stunned. Blitzkrieg, they called it, lightning war, and Poland was the proving ground. By the time Anna Pawlik found herself standing in that classroom, Poland as a political entity no longer existed. The cities had new German names. The streets were patrolled by Wehrmacht soldiers and SS officers, and the Polish people had been reduced to a labor force for the Reich. Speaking Polish in public could get you beaten, hiding a Jew could get you shot, and any hint of resistance could mean the entire village burned to the ground. This was the world Anna lived in, a world where survival meant keeping your head down, your mouth shut, and your hatred buried so deep that even your own face couldn't betray you. Anna Pawlik had been a geography teacher before the war, respected in her community, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to make even the driest subject come alive for her students. She had taught Polish children to read maps, to understand topography, to see the land not just as dirt and trees, but as a living puzzle that could be understood and navigated. She had spent years walking the forests and fields around her town, sketching the curves of rivers, noting where the ground turned soft in spring, memorizing the locations of old logging roads that didn't appear on any official map. Her knowledge of the region was encyclopedic, the kind of deep familiarity that only comes from a lifetime spent in one place. When the Germans arrived and began their occupation, they quickly realized they had a problem. Their maps of the region were outdated, inaccurate, and often completely wrong. The Poland they had conquered on paper was not the Poland they found on the ground. The Wehrmacht needed local guides, people who knew the terrain, and they began conscripting anyone with useful knowledge. Teachers, foresters, postal workers, anyone who might be able to help them navigate this conquered land. Anna was an obvious choice. She was educated, she was known to be competent, and most importantly, she appeared to be cooperative. The Germans brought her in, showed her their maps and asked her to correct them, to add details, to help them understand the roads and rivers and forests that surrounded the town. They promised her nothing, threatened her with everything, and assumed that like most conquered people she would comply out of fear if not out of pragmatism. They were right about the fear. They were catastrophically wrong about the compliance. Anna understood immediately what they were asking her to do. They wanted her to give them the keys to the kingdom, to hand over the intimate knowledge of the land that could mean the difference between a successful supply convoy and a column of trucks stuck axle-deep in mud. They wanted her to show them the shortcuts, the safe river crossings, the roads that could handle heavy vehicles even in bad weather. They wanted her expertise, and they assumed she would give it freely because what choice did she have? But Anna Pawlik had been thinking about this moment since the day the Germans arrived. She had been waiting for an opportunity, not to fight with weapons she didn't have, but to fight with the one thing the occupation couldn't take from her, her knowledge. And so she made a decision that would require more courage than any battlefield heroics. She would give them exactly what they asked for. She would teach them to read the maps. She would just teach them wrong. The first lesson began on a cold morning in late autumn, with 6 German officers sitting in wooden chairs that were too small for them, holding pencils like schoolboys, while Anna stood at the chalkboard and began to redraw the world. She started with the river that ran north of the town, a shallow, easily crossed waterway that the locals used for fishing. On the German map, it was marked correctly. Anna erased it and drew it 3 kilometers to the west, right where the ground turned to swamp. Then she marked it as the safest crossing point in the region, the place where the water was shallowest and the banks most stable. The officers copied her marks onto their own maps without question. After all, she was the expert. Why would she lie? The deception had to be perfect, and Anna knew that perfection in lying required a foundation of truth. She couldn't simply invent a completely fictional landscape, because the Germans would test her information, they would send scouts, they would compare her maps to their own observations. So she built her lies carefully. Like a master forger who knows that the best counterfeit is 99% real, she would identify real roads, real rivers, real landmarks, and then she would shift them just enough to be deadly. A road that turned north would be drawn turning south. A ford that was passable in summer would be marked as safe year-round, ensuring that any convoy attempting to cross in spring would sink into the muddy riverbed. A forest path that led to a dead end against a cliff face would be marked as a through route to the next village. The genius of her sabotage was in its subtlety. These weren't obvious errors that would be caught immediately. These were the kind of mistakes that would only reveal themselves when it was too late, when the trucks were already stuck, when the soldiers were already lost, when the supplies meant for the front lines were sitting abandoned in a forest clearing because the map promised a road that didn't exist. The German officers who attended her lessons were not stupid men, and that made Anna's task infinitely more dangerous. These were trained military personnel, men who had navigated campaigns across Europe, who understood logistics and terrain and the importance of accurate intelligence. They asked questions, they challenged her assertions, they cross-referenced her information with their existing maps. Anna had anticipated this. For every lie she told, she offered 3 truths. For every landmark she moved, she correctly identified 5 others. She praised the quality of their existing maps, pointing out where the German cartographers had been accurate, building trust with every sincere compliment. She explained her corrections in technical terms, using the language of elevation and gradient and soil composition, speaking with the confident authority of someone who had walked every meter of this land. When an officer questioned why a particular road wasn't on their original map, she would explain that it was a logging road, built by local workers, too new to appear on pre-war surveys. The officers would nod, make their notes, and thank her for her expertise. The psychological burden of what Anna was doing was immense, and it's important to understand the tightrope she walked every single day. She was living in a town where German soldiers were everywhere, where any neighbor could be an informant, where a single suspicious glance could lead to interrogation and torture. She had to maintain the performance of a compliant, helpful teacher, not just during her lessons, but every moment of every day. She had to smile at the soldiers on the street. She had to appear neither too friendly nor too cold. She had to project the exact demeanor of someone who had accepted the occupation and was simply trying to survive. At night, alone in her small apartment, she would allow herself to feel the terror of what she was doing, the knowledge that if she was caught, she wouldn't just be executed, she would be tortured first, forced to reveal everything, forced to watch as they punished everyone she had ever known. But in the morning, she would wash her face, put on her modest dress, and walk back to that classroom with her head high and her hands steady. The impact of Anna's sabotage began to reveal itself slowly, like a poison working through a system. The Germans didn't realize immediately that their problems were connected to the maps. When a supply convoy failed to arrive at the front, they assumed it was partisan activity or mechanical failure, or incompetent drivers. When a reconnaissance unit spent 3 days lost in the forest before staggering back to base, hungry and disoriented, they blamed poor leadership. When a column of trucks attempting to cross what their maps showed as a solid road instead found themselves hub-deep in marsh water, ruining their engines and losing precious time, they cursed the weather and the terrain. It took weeks before someone began to notice the pattern, before an intelligence officer started comparing reports and realized that every one of these failures involved units that had been operating in the region around Anna's town, units that had been using the corrected maps she had provided. By then, the damage was substantial. And more importantly, by then those maps had been copied and distributed to other units, spreading Anna's lies across a wider area like a virus. The crucial moment came in early 1942 when the Germans began planning a major operation that required moving significant forces through the region. They had been using Anna's maps for months by this point, incorporating her corrections into their operational planning. The offensive was designed to cut off a Soviet position using what their maps indicated were solid, reliable supply routes through territory they believed they understood. Hannah knew about the operation because the officers had asked her specific questions about load-bearing capacity on certain roads, about whether particular bridges could handle heavy vehicles, about alternate routes in case of unexpected delays. She had answered every question with helpful lies, steering them toward roads that would collapse under the weight of tanks, bridges that would give way, paths that led nowhere. When the operation launched, it was a disaster. Entire units found themselves separated from their supply lines, unable to navigate terrain that bore no resemblance to their maps, vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks because they were exactly where they shouldn't have been. The Germans lost hundreds of men, countless vehicles, and precious time, all because they trusted a teacher who had taught them to read maps that described a world that didn't exist. The aftermath of the failed operation brought a wave of paranoia through the German command structure, and Anna could feel the atmosphere changing around her like the air before a thunderstorm. Officers who had once been merely professional in their interactions with her now watched her with narrowed eyes, studying her face for signs of deception. The questions in her lessons became sharper, more probing, designed to catch inconsistencies. They began sending out verification patrols specifically to check the landmarks she had identified, comparing the real world to the maps she had helped them create. Hannah knew she was walking on a razor's edge now, that any mistake could expose her, but she also understood something crucial about human psychology that kept her alive. The Germans desperately wanted to believe her maps were correct, because admitting they had been deceived would mean admitting that their entire understanding of the region was compromised, that months of planning had been based on false information, and that the disaster of the recent operation was their own fault for trusting her. It was easier to blame other factors, to convince themselves that the problems were unrelated coincidences, rather than face the humiliating truth that a Polish schoolteacher had outsmarted their entire intelligence apparatus. Anna adapted her strategy, becoming even more careful about which lies she told and how she told them. She stopped making dramatic alterations and instead focused on subtle shifts that would be almost impossible to verify without extensive ground reconnaissance. She would slightly miscalculate distances, turning a 5-kilometer journey into 8 kilometers of difficult terrain. She would describe seasonal conditions incorrectly, marking summer paths as winter safe and vice versa, knowing that by the time the Germans discovered the error, the seasons would have changed, and they would assume the conditions had simply shifted. She began incorporating information that was technically true, but strategically misleading, showing them shortcuts that existed but were too narrow for military vehicles, or river crossings that were possible but only at specific water levels that occurred rarely. The beauty of these lies was that they were defensible. If questioned, she could honestly say, yes, that path exists, yes, that crossing is there, and the Germans would have no way to prove that she had deliberately failed to mention the crucial details that made those routes useless for their purposes. The human cost of what Anna was doing became more apparent as the months wore on, and it weighed on her in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. German soldiers were dying because of her lies, young men who had been conscripted into Hitler's army, many of them no more enthusiastic about the war than she was. She would see them in the town, fresh-faced boys who looked barely old enough to shave, and she would know that some of them would die in the swamps or forests because they followed maps she had corrupted. She had to make peace with that reality, had to accept that in war there are no clean hands, and that the Germans dying lost in the wilderness were soldiers who would otherwise be killing Polish civilians, burning villages, or manning the checkpoints where Jews were being rounded up and shipped to camps. She reminded herself every day that this was not murder, this was resistance, and that every convoy delayed, every unit disoriented, every supply line broken meant resources diverted from the front lines, meant operations postponed, meant lives saved elsewhere, even if she would never know whose lives or where. The isolation of Anna's resistance was perhaps its most difficult aspect, because she could never share what she was doing with anyone, could never seek advice or comfort or validation. Resistance movements in occupied Poland were numerous and well organized, with networks of fighters and saboteurs working together, supporting each other, sharing the psychological burden of their dangerous work. Anna had none of that. She couldn't risk telling anyone about her sabotage, because even a trusted friend might accidentally reveal something, might react differently to her in front of the Germans, might try to help in ways that would only expose them both. So she carried her secret alone, going to her lessons each day and lying with a smile, then returning to her empty apartment where she would sit in the dark and wonder if what she was doing mattered, if anyone would ever know, if she would survive long enough to see Poland free again. The loneliness was a different kind of courage, the ability to keep fighting a war that no one else knew you were fighting, to risk everything for a cause you could never claim credit for. By the spring of 1943, Anna had been teaching the Germans for nearly 2 years, and the accumulated impact of her sabotage had become significant enough that the Wehrmacht's operations in the region were noticeably less effective than in surrounding areas. They were losing more supplies, experiencing more delays, suffering more casualties from getting lost or trapped in bad terrain. The German command knew something was wrong, but they still couldn't quite identify the source, because Anna's lies had been incorporated into so many different maps and plans that untangling them would have required starting over completely, recharting the entire region from scratch. That would have meant admitting the scale of the deception, acknowledging that their pride and their assumptions about Polish inferiority had allowed them to be systematically misled for years. So instead they continued using the corrupted maps, continued planning operations based on false information, and continued losing men and materiel to terrain that refused to match their understanding of it, all while Anna stood at her chalkboard and drew more careful lies. The turning point came in the summer of 1943, when a new officer arrived in the town, a captain named Heinrich Müller, who had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Unlike the other officers who had rotated through Anna's classroom, Müller was a trained cartographer before the war, someone who understood maps not just as tools, but as precise scientific instruments. He had been sent specifically to investigate the unusual failure rate of operations in the region, and he approached the task with the methodical determination of someone who believed that every problem had a discoverable solution. Anna knew from the moment she met him that Müller was different, more dangerous than all the others combined. He didn't just copy her corrections onto his maps. He questioned the methodology behind them, asked her to explain not just where landmarks were, but how she had determined their positions, what references she had used, what margins of error might exist. He treated her like a colleague rather than a conquered subject, which was somehow more terrifying because it meant he was actually paying attention. Müller began conducting his own surveys, taking small teams into the countryside with surveying equipment, checking Anna's marked locations against reality. At first, Anna thought this would be the end, that he would immediately discover the discrepancies, and she would be arrested, tortured, executed. But something unexpected happened. Müller's surveys confirmed most of Anna's information as accurate, because Anna had been careful to make most of her information accurate. The roads she had correctly identified, the landmarks she had properly placed, the distances she had calculated honestly, all of these checked out perfectly. Müller found himself in the frustrating position of verifying that Anna's work was generally excellent, which made it even harder to explain why operations kept failing. He began to suspect that the problem wasn't the maps themselves, but something more complex, some interaction between terrain and weather and timing that he couldn't quite identify. Anna watched him struggle with this puzzle and realized she had an opportunity. If she could guide his investigation away from the maps and toward other explanations, she might survive his scrutiny. She began feeding Müller theories about seasonal variation, explaining in careful technical detail how the same terrain could be completely different in spring versus summer, how rain patterns affected soil stability, how winter freezing and thawing cycles could transform roads from solid to impassable. All of this was true, and Miller, being an educated man, understood and appreciated the complexity she was describing. Anna suggested that perhaps the problem wasn't the maps, but the fact that the Wehrmacht was using static maps for dynamic terrain, that they needed seasonal updates and real-time reconnaissance, rather than relying on fixed documents. This appealed to Müller's professional pride because it meant the solution was more surveying, more data collection, more of the scientific work he excelled at. He began filing reports recommending expanded cartographic operations, requesting more equipment and personnel, essentially proposing that the Germans invest even more resources into a mapping project that Anna was quietly corrupting from within. The irony was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The increased scrutiny meant Anna had to be even more careful, but it also gave her new opportunities for sabotage. As Müller expanded his surveying operations, he needed local assistance, people to carry equipment, to point out landmarks, to verify place names. Anna volunteered to help coordinate this local labor, which meant she could carefully select which Poles worked with the Germans and quietly ensure that those workers understood, through subtle signals and careful conversations, to provide information that was just slightly off, just enough to compound the existing errors without being obviously false. She was building a network of micro-sabotage, dozens of small lies told by dozens of different people, all adding up to a comprehensive distortion of reality. The Germans were now not just using corrupted maps, but actively generating new corrupted data, all while believing they were finally solving the problem that had plagued them for years. The psychological toll on Anna during this period was immense, because working closely with Müller meant spending hours each day with a man who was intelligent, professional, and in another world might have been someone she could respect or even befriend. He treated her with courtesy, valued her expertise, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the landscape of her homeland. She had to constantly remind herself that this man, regardless of his personal qualities, was part of a machine that was destroying Poland, that was murdering millions, that had to be resisted by any means necessary. There were moments when she felt almost guilty for deceiving him, when his enthusiasm for a particularly clever solution to a mapping problem would make her smile despite herself. And then she would walk home past the checkpoint where Jews were being processed for transport, and the guilt would transform into rage and determination. Müller was the acceptable face of occupation, the educated, reasonable Nazi who made conquest seem civilized, and that made him more dangerous than the crude soldiers who at least had the honesty to show their brutality openly. By the winter of 1943, Anna's operation had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple map sabotage. She had become, without any official recognition or support, the coordinator of a resistance cell that operated entirely through the manipulation of information. The Poles she had recruited to assist with Müller's surveying project had become a silent network, passing information among themselves about which landmarks to misidentify, which distances to slightly exaggerate, which terrain features to describe inaccurately. None of them ever spoke directly about what they were doing, because the risk of exposure was too great, but they developed a shared understanding through careful observation and subtle signals. When Anna would emphasize certain words during conversations with the German officers, her network would know which areas were being targeted for upcoming operations and could adjust their sabotage accordingly. It was resistance by bureaucracy, warfare by paperwork, and it was devastatingly effective precisely because it was so mundane that the Germans never suspected they were being attacked. The winter brought new challenges and new opportunities. The Germans were planning a major spring offensive, and Müller had been tasked with creating comprehensive tactical maps for the operation. This meant months of intensive work, with Anna effectively serving as his primary consultant on local conditions. She found herself in the extraordinary position of being shown German operational plans, of knowing in advance where they intended to move troops, where they planned to establish supply depots, which routes they considered critical for success. It was intelligence that any resistance movement would kill to possess, and Anna had it simply because the Germans had decided she was too useful and too thoroughly vetted to be dangerous. She couldn't communicate this information to any organized resistance because she had no contacts and no safe way to establish them. but she could use it to make her sabotage more targeted and more damaging. Every route the Germans marked as critical, she would subtly undermine. Every backup plan they developed, she would quietly compromise. She was fighting an entire offensive before it even began, armed with nothing but chalk and lies. The relationship between Anna and Müller had become complex in ways that made Anna deeply uncomfortable. Müller had developed what seemed to be genuine respect for her, frequently praising her knowledge and expertise to other officers, defending her when some questioned why they were relying so heavily on a Pole. He had even begun sharing aspects of his personal life, showing her photographs of his wife and children back in Germany, talking about his hopes to return to university teaching after the war. Anna realized with a cold clarity that Müller was lonely, that he missed intellectual companionship, and that he had convinced himself that their professional relationship was somehow separate from the larger context of occupation and genocide. She exploited this loneliness ruthlessly, encouraging his trust, listening sympathetically to his complaints about military bureaucracy, playing the role of the one person in this town who understood the importance of his work. Every moment of false friendship was a weapon, every smile a calculated deception, and Anna hated what it required her to become even as she recognized its necessity. The breaking point came in March of 1944, when Müller made a discovery that Anna had dreaded for months. He had been comparing historical maps from before the war with current survey data and noticed something that troubled him. A river that appeared on pre-war Polish maps in one location appeared on Anna's corrected German maps in a slightly different location, shifted by nearly 2 kilometers. Müller brought this to Anna's attention not as an accusation but as a puzzle, asking her to explain the discrepancy. Anna's heart was pounding so hard she was certain Müller could hear it, but her voice remained calm and steady as she explained that the pre-war maps were notoriously inaccurate, created by underfunded Polish survey departments using outdated equipment, and that her corrections were based on actual ground observation rather than old documents. She even managed to turn the moment into a criticism of Polish incompetence, suggesting that this was exactly why Poland had been so easy to conquer. They couldn't even map their own country correctly. Müller laughed at that, agreed that Polish technical standards were inferior, and accepted her explanation without further question. Anna excused herself shortly after, walked to a supply closet, and vomited quietly from the sheer terror and self-loathing of what she had just done. The incident with the pre-war maps was a warning that Anna's operation was approaching its natural end. The longer she continued, the more data the Germans accumulated, the greater the chance that someone would notice the patterns and expose her. She began to consider what her endgame might look like, whether she could arrange some plausible reason to stop working with the Germans, or whether she would have to continue until either the occupation ended or she was discovered. The spring offensive was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, and Anna knew that if it failed as catastrophically as she hoped it would, the Germans would conduct a thorough investigation into why. Müller would be forced to defend his maps, to prove their accuracy, and the scrutiny would be far more intense than anything Anna had faced before. She was running out of time, running out of luck, and running out of ways to explain away the mounting evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the German understanding of the terrain. The trap she had been building for 2 years was about to close, and she couldn't be certain whether it would catch the Germans or herself. The spring offensive launched on April 12, 1944, and Anna spent the first 3 days in a state of suspended terror, waiting to hear whether her sabotage would be discovered or whether it would work as she had planned. The Germans had committed significant resources to the operation, thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles moving through the region, using maps that Anna and her network had carefully corrupted over months of preparation. She continued her normal routine, teaching her classes, meeting with Müller to discuss logistical details, maintaining the performance of helpful cooperation even as every nerve in her body screamed with tension. The first reports came back after 48 hours, and they were confused and contradictory. Units were reporting unexpected delays, supply convoys were failing to reach their destinations, entire companies were reporting positions that didn't match where command expected them to be. The operations room where Müller worked became a chaos of shouting officers, conflicting reports and frantic attempts to understand why nothing was going according to plan. On the 4th day, the situation deteriorated from confusion into disaster. A mechanized column that was supposed to be advancing on a Soviet position instead found itself trapped in marshland, with dozens of vehicles stuck and unable to move forward or backward. The maps had shown solid ground, a wide, reliable road that could handle heavy traffic. The reality was a bog that swallowed tanks like quicksand. Another unit, attempting to use what their maps indicated was a mountain pass suitable for vehicle traffic, discovered instead a narrow footpath that led to a sheer cliff face, forcing them to abandon their vehicles and backtrack on foot, losing 2 days and leaving expensive equipment undefended. A third group, following a route Anna had marked as a shortcut to the front lines, ended up in a dense forest with no exit, spending 36 hours trying to navigate their way out while their fuel ran low and their communications equipment failed in the thick canopy. The offensive, which was supposed to be a swift, decisive strike, had turned into a slow-motion catastrophe of lost units, stranded equipment, and commanders who had no idea where their own forces actually were. Müller was destroyed by the failure, not physically but psychologically, and Anna watched his disintegration with a mixture of satisfaction and pity that made her feel like a monster. He stopped sleeping, spent days and nights in the operations room trying to reconcile the maps with the reality his men were reporting, searching desperately for the error that had caused this comprehensive breakdown. Other officers blamed him directly, accusing him of incompetence, suggesting his maps were worthless fantasies. Müller defended himself by pointing to all the verification surveys he had conducted, all the data he had collected, all the local expertise he had consulted. He showed them Anna's credentials, her years of experience, the fact that she had been thoroughly vetted and had been cooperating for nearly 3 years without incident. How could she have been lying, he argued, when so much of her information had been verified as accurate? The other officers had no answer, because they couldn't explain it either, but they needed someone to blame, and Müller was convenient. Hannah knew she should feel triumphant, that this was exactly what she had been working toward, but instead she felt hollowed out, exhausted by the weight of maintaining her deception while watching a man she had manipulated fall apart. The investigation into the failed offensive was swift and brutal, and Anna prepared herself for arrest and execution. She destroyed the few personal items she cared about, wrote no letters because there was no one to write to, and made peace with the fact that she would die without anyone knowing what she had done. But the investigation, when it came, focused not on the maps, but on the local Polish workers who had assisted with the surveys. The Germans had decided that the sabotage must have come from the laborers, that these Poles had deliberately provided false information while Müller and his team had been too trusting to catch the deception. It was exactly backwards from the truth, but it fit the German narrative better. Because it meant their own people hadn't been fooled, they had simply been betrayed by treacherous locals. Over the course of a week, 17 Polish men and women were arrested, accused of sabotage and espionage. Anna knew some of them, had worked with some of them, had recruited some of them into her network. They were tortured for information they didn't have, because none of them knew the full scope of what Anna had been doing. None of them understood how the pieces fit together. 3 of them were executed publicly in the town square as a warning. Anna watched from her window, forcing herself to witness what her resistance had cost, burning their faces into her memory, because she owed them at least that much. The executions should have been the end of Anna's operation, should have been the moment when the Germans realized they needed to start over with new maps and new sources. Instead, something unexpected happened. Müller, desperate to salvage his career and his reputation, proposed that the problem wasn't the core methodology, but the verification process. He argued that the Polish workers had been insufficiently supervised, that their information hadn't been properly cross-checked, and that what was needed was a more rigorous system with better oversight. His superiors, faced with the alternative of admitting they had wasted 2 years and countless resources on fundamentally flawed maps, accepted this explanation. They approved Müller's proposal for expanded operations with stricter protocols, which meant more surveying, more data collection, and more reliance on the one source who had been consistently helpful and apparently trustworthy, Anna Pawlik. She was being promoted, in effect, rewarded with greater responsibility and greater access to German planning, all because the Germans needed to believe that their system worked, and that the failure had been an anomaly rather than a fundamental deception. Anna accepted the new role with appropriate gratitude and began planning how she could use this expanded access to cause even more damage before the war finally ended, or before her luck finally ran out. The summer of 1944 brought dramatic changes to the war that even Anna, isolated in her small occupied town, could sense like a shift in the wind. The Soviet Red Army was advancing westward with a momentum that seemed unstoppable, pushing the Germans back across territory they had held for years. The Wehrmacht was no longer conducting offensives in the region, but instead preparing defensive positions, trying to slow the Soviet advance and buy time for a retreat that everyone knew was inevitable, even if no one dared say it aloud. For Anna, this shift meant her sabotage took on a different character. She was no longer trying to disrupt German attacks, but instead trying to undermine their ability to defend and retreat effectively. Every map she corrupted now had the potential to trap German units in positions where they couldn't escape, to direct reinforcements away from critical defensive lines, to ensure that when the Soviets arrived, the Wehrmacht would be disorganized and vulnerable. The stakes were higher because failure now meant not just a military setback, but potentially the difference between her town being liberated or being destroyed in a desperate last stand. Müller had become increasingly erratic as the military situation deteriorated, oscillating between manic energy as he tried to perfect his mapping systems and deep depression when he contemplated what defeat would mean for him personally. He had been officially reprimanded for the spring offensive disaster and knew that another failure would likely mean a transfer to the Eastern Front in a combat role, essentially a death sentence for a middle-aged cartographer with no battlefield experience. This desperation made him both more dangerous and more vulnerable. He checked and rechecked every piece of information obsessively, which meant Anna had to be extraordinarily careful, but he was also so focused on avoiding another catastrophic mistake that he became almost paralyzed, unable to trust his own judgment and increasingly dependent on Anna to make decisions for him. She exploited this dependency ruthlessly, gradually taking over more and more of the actual map-making work, while Müller nominally supervised, which gave her even greater control over what information reached German command. She was no longer just an advisor, she was effectively running the cartographic operation, while Müller took credit and absorbed blame in equal measure. The most dangerous moment came in August, when a Wehrmacht colonel arrived to personally inspect the mapping operation after several defensive positions had been overrun more quickly than expected. The colonel was a veteran of the Russian front, a hard man who had survived years of brutal warfare and had developed a deep distrust of anything that seemed too convenient or too easy. He walked into Anna's classroom unannounced one morning, dismissed Müller from the room, and spent 3 hours interrogating Anna about her methods, her sources, and her loyalties. He didn't ask polite questions like Müller had. He made accusations and watched her reactions, trying to catch her in contradictions or hesitations. Anna understood immediately that this man was testing her at a level that no one had before, that he had seen enough wartime deception to recognize the patterns, and that her survival depended on being absolutely perfect in this moment. She met his aggression with calm professionalism, answering every question directly, showing him her reference materials, walking him through specific examples of how she had corrected German maps, even pointing out a few deliberate errors that she claimed to have found and fixed. The last part was a calculated risk, but it worked, because by identifying errors that the Germans had made, she positioned herself as someone who was catching mistakes rather than creating them. The colonel left without arresting her, but Anna knew she had been marked as a potential problem. She could see it in the way German soldiers now watched her more carefully, in the way her movements around town were suddenly being tracked, in the casual questions neighbors asked about her activities that felt like interrogations disguised as conversation. Someone had been assigned to observe her, to look for evidence of sabotage or resistance connections. Anna adapted by becoming even more visibly cooperative, volunteering for additional work, praising German efficiency loudly in public spaces, playing the role of the collaborator so convincingly that it made her physically ill. She knew that actual collaborators existed in every occupied town, Poles who had decided that survival meant serving the Germans, and she understood now how easy it would be for people to believe she was one of them. Her reputation was being destroyed in service of her mission, and she had to accept that even after the war ended, even if she survived, there would be people in her community who would always believe she had been a traitor. The cost of effective resistance, she was learning, wasn't just the risk of death, but the certainty of misunderstanding. By September, the Soviet advance had brought the front lines close enough that Anna could hear artillery fire at night, a distant rumble like summer thunder that never stopped. The Germans were preparing for evacuation, destroying records, packing equipment, planning their retreat routes. Müller came to Anna with what he called his most important assignment, the creation of detailed maps for the Wehrmacht's withdrawal, showing the safest and fastest routes west, away from the advancing Soviets. This was Anna's final opportunity, the culmination of 3 years of careful deception. The maps she created now would determine whether the German retreat was orderly or chaotic, whether they could extract their forces efficiently, or whether they would be caught and destroyed during the withdrawal. She worked for 72 hours straight, drawing maps that showed roads that didn't exist, bridges that had been destroyed, routes that led into dead ends or ambush positions. She marked dangerous areas as safe and safe areas as dangerous. She created a masterpiece of misinformation, a comprehensive guide to catastrophic failure disguised as professional cartography. Müller reviewed her work with tears in his eyes, thanking her for her dedication and loyalty, telling her that these maps might save thousands of German lives. Anna smiled and accepted his gratitude, knowing that she had just ensured those lives would be lost instead, that the Wehrmacht retreat through this region would be remembered as one of the most disorganized and costly withdrawals of the entire war. The German retreat began on October 4, 1944, and within hours it became clear that something was catastrophically wrong. The main withdrawal route that Anna had marked as the safest passage west led directly into a region where recent rains had turned the roads into rivers of mud, impassable for the heavy vehicles and artillery pieces the Wehrmacht was trying to evacuate. Entire columns became stuck, blocking the road for units behind them, creating a massive traffic jam of soldiers and equipment that stretched for kilometers and became a perfect target for Soviet aircraft and artillery. A secondary route that Anna had marked as an alternate path led to a bridge that had been destroyed by partisans 2 months earlier, a fact she had deliberately omitted from her maps. When the German engineers arrived expecting to cross, they found nothing but broken pilings jutting from the water, and no time to build a replacement before Soviet tanks arrived. Unit after unit found themselves trapped, surrounded, or forced to abandon their equipment and flee on foot through forests and swamps, exactly as Anna had planned. The orderly withdrawal that German command had envisioned dissolved into panicked chaos, and the Wehrmacht lost more men and material in that retreat than they had in months of actual combat. Müller realized what had happened on the second day of the evacuation, when the reports of failed routes and blocked passages became too numerous and too consistent to be coincidence. Anna watched him make the connection, saw the moment when his face changed from confusion to horrified understanding, when he looked at her across the operations room and knew, absolutely knew, that she had been lying to him for 3 years. He didn't say anything, didn't raise an alarm, didn't order her arrest. He simply stared at her with an expression of such complete betrayal and devastation that Anna almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because whatever personal betrayal Müller was experiencing, it paled in comparison to what his army had done to Poland, to what he had facilitated by making that army more efficient. Anna held his gaze, let him see that she understood what he had realized, and then she turned and walked out of the operations room. No one stopped her. In the chaos of the retreat, with officers shouting and radios crackling and reports flooding in of disaster after disaster, one Polish woman leaving a building didn't seem important enough to worry about. She walked through the town that had been her prison for 3 years, past German soldiers frantically loading trucks, past abandoned checkpoints, past the square where 3 of her network had been executed, and she kept walking until she reached the forest. Anna spent the next 4 days hiding in the woods, surviving on wild berries and water from streams, moving steadily east toward the sound of Soviet artillery. She didn't know if the Germans were looking for her specifically, or if they were too busy trying to save themselves to care about one saboteur among many. She didn't know if Müller had reported her, or if his shame at being deceived so thoroughly had kept him silent. She only knew that staying in the town meant certain death if the Germans found her, and that the forest, despite its dangers, was safer than anywhere the Wehrmacht still controlled. On the fifth day, she encountered a Soviet patrol, young soldiers who initially thought she might be a German spy, until she began speaking in Polish and explaining what she had done. They didn't entirely believe her story. It seemed too extraordinary, too unlikely that one woman could have caused the kind of damage she was claiming. But they took her to their command post where more senior officers could evaluate her claims. Anna spent hours being interrogated by Soviet intelligence, describing in detail the maps she had created, the operations she had undermined, the methods she had used. They were impressed, but also suspicious, questioning why she hadn't tried to contact Soviet forces earlier, why she had worked alone rather than joining an organized resistance group. Anna had no good answer except the truth, that she had been afraid, that she hadn't known who to trust, that she had simply done what she could with the opportunities she had. The Soviet liberation of Anna's town came 3 days after her escape, and by all accounts, it was more brutal and chaotic than it should have been, precisely because the German defensive positions were so disorganized and poorly coordinated thanks to the corrupted maps they had relied on. The fighting was fierce but brief, and when it ended, the Wehrmacht had been effectively destroyed as a coherent force in the region. Müller was killed during the battle, along with most of the officers who had worked with Anna over the years. She felt nothing when she heard this news, no satisfaction, no regret, just a profound emptiness at the waste of it all. The Soviets wanted to parade her as a hero, to use her story for propaganda purposes, to show how Polish resistance had contributed to the Soviet victory. Anna refused. She told them she would give a full debriefing about her methods and her activities for military intelligence purposes, but she would not be photographed, would not be interviewed, would not be turned into a symbol. She had done what she needed to do, and now she wanted to be forgotten. The Soviet officers, perhaps recognizing something in her eyes that warned against pushing too hard, agreed to keep her identity classified. When Anna finally returned to her town after it had been secured, she found a community that didn't know how to treat her. Some had heard rumors about what she had done and considered her a hero. Others had seen her cooperation with the Germans and considered her a collaborator, someone who had survived by serving the enemy while others had died resisting. Most fell somewhere in between, uncertain and uncomfortable, not sure whether to welcome her or shun her. Anna made it easier for everyone by not staying. She packed the few possessions that remained in her apartment, said goodbye to no one, and left for Krakow where no one knew her face or her history. She found work as a clerk in a government office, a quiet, anonymous job that required no explanation of her past, and she rebuilt her life in silence. She never spoke publicly about what she had done during the war, never wrote her memoirs, never sought recognition or compensation. When asked about the occupation years, she would say simply that she had survived and changed the subject. The only record of her sabotage exists in classified Soviet intelligence files and scattered German military reports that mention unexplained failures and corrupted maps without ever identifying the source. Anna Pawlik became a ghost in her own story, known to history only through the gaps she created in someone else's plans. The immediate aftermath of the war brought a reckoning that was both official and personal, as Poland tried to sort through who had resisted, who had collaborated, and who had simply survived in the grey space between. Special tribunals were established to investigate war crimes and collaboration, and many people who had worked with the Germans in any capacity found themselves under scrutiny, regardless of their actual loyalties or actions. Anna was investigated twice, once by Polish authorities and once by Soviet security services, both times facing questions about her years of working closely with Wehrmacht officers and her apparent cooperation with the occupation. She provided detailed testimony about her sabotage activities, describing specific operations she had undermined, specific maps she had corrupted, specific German failures that could be traced to her misinformation. The investigators found her story difficult to verify, because so many of the German officers who could have confirmed or denied her claims were dead, and the German records that might have documented the failures had been destroyed during the retreat. Ultimately, the investigations concluded that her story was plausible, and her actions, if true, had been valuable to the Allied cause, but without definitive proof, she remained under a cloud of suspicion that followed her for years. The personal reckoning was harder than the official one because it involved people Anna had known her entire life, neighbors and former students and fellow teachers who had their own memories of the occupation and their own opinions about who had behaved honorably. Some refused to believe that she had been sabotaging the Germans, convinced that her story was a convenient fiction created after liberation to excuse collaboration. They remembered seeing her smile at German soldiers, remembered hearing her speak German fluently, remembered that she had been trusted by the occupation authorities while others were being arrested and executed. No amount of explanation could change what they had seen with their own eyes, and Anna eventually stopped trying to convince them. Others believed her story, but resented that she had survived and succeeded, while their own acts of resistance had led to death or suffering. Why had she been so lucky, they asked? Why had she been able to fool the Germans for years while others were caught and killed for far less? There was an implied accusation in these questions, a suggestion that perhaps her success meant she hadn't actually been taking real risks, that perhaps her sabotage had been less dangerous than she claimed. Hannah had no answer for this except to point to the 3 people from her network who had been executed, to the guilt she carried for their deaths. But even this felt inadequate when talking to people who had lost entire families. The communist government that took power in Poland after the war had its own complicated relationship with Anna's story. On one hand, her resistance against the Nazis fit perfectly into the narrative of Polish heroism and suffering that the government wanted to promote. On the other hand, her work had been solitary and independent, not connected to any communist resistance organization, which made it ideologically inconvenient. The government preferred stories of collective resistance, of workers and peasants organizing together under party leadership, not stories of lone individuals acting on their own initiative. Anna was offered opportunities to join the party, to be recognized officially as a war hero, to have her story incorporated into the official history, but all of these offers came with conditions about how her story would be told and what conclusions would be drawn from it. She refused them all, understanding that accepting would mean surrendering control of her narrative and allowing it to be reshaped for political purposes. This refusal meant that her story remained largely unknown outside of classified records and private conversations, but it also meant that it remained hers, uncompromised by ideology or propaganda. The physical and psychological toll of what Anna had endured during the war only became fully apparent in the years after liberation, when the immediate crisis was over, and she no longer needed to maintain the performance of strength and control. She began having nightmares about being discovered by the Germans, dreams where Müller would look at her with that expression of betrayal, and this time would give the order for her execution. She would wake up gasping, uncertain for a moment whether the war was over or if she was still trapped in that classroom drawing lies on a chalkboard. She developed an aversion to maps, finding it difficult to look at any kind of geographic representation without feeling a complex mixture of pride and revulsion at what she had accomplished with similar tools. Simple things would trigger memories: the smell of chalk dust, the sound of German being spoken, the sight of military vehicles on the street, and she would have to stop whatever she was doing and breathe slowly until the panic passed. She saw doctors who had little understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, who prescribed rest and fresh air and suggested she needed to simply move on with her life. Anna knew it wasn't that simple, but she also knew there was no real treatment available, so she learned to manage her symptoms privately, to function in public while falling apart in private, which was not so different from what she had done during the war. By the early 1950s, Anna had built a stable if unremarkable life in Krakow. She had a job, a small apartment, a few acquaintances, though no close friends. She dated occasionally but never seriously, never allowing anyone close enough to ask too many questions about her past. She attended cultural events, read voraciously, took long walks through the city, and to any outside observer, She appeared to be simply another middle-aged woman rebuilding her life after the devastation of war. Only Anna knew that she was still fighting the war in her head, still trying to reconcile what she had done with who she had become, still wondering if the cost had been worth the result. She thought often about the 3 people from her network who had been executed, wondered if they had understood what they were dying for, hoped that somehow they had known they hadn't died for nothing. She thought about the German soldiers who had died lost in forests or trapped in marshes because of her maps, boys barely old enough to shave who had probably been conscripted against their will. She thought about Müller, about that final look of betrayal, and tried to feel satisfaction at having defeated him, but mostly just felt tired. The war had ended, but the battle in Anna's mind continued, and she began to accept that it might never truly be over, that this was simply what survival looked like for someone who had fought the kind of war she had fought. Anna Pawlik died in 1978 at the age of 63 in a hospital in Krakow from complications related to pneumonia. She died quietly, with no family present because she had never married or had children, attended only by a nurse who knew nothing about her history. Her death was recorded in the standard bureaucratic fashion, a small notice in the local newspaper that listed her name, her age and her profession as retired government clerk. There was no mention of the war, no reference to her resistance activities, no acknowledgement that this woman had single-handedly disrupted German military operations for years through nothing but intelligence and courage. The few people who attended her funeral were colleagues from her office work, people who had known her as quiet and competent, but ultimately unremarkable. No government officials came, no military representatives, no historians interested in documenting her story. She was buried in a common grave, her headstone bearing only her name and dates, and within a decade, even those who had attended her funeral had largely forgotten her. Anna Pawlik, who had changed the course of military history in her small corner of the war, disappeared into obscurity as thoroughly as if she had never existed at all. The story of what Anna accomplished remained hidden in classified files for decades after her death, buried in Soviet military intelligence archives and scattered German documents that survived the war. Historians researching the Wehrmacht's chaotic retreat from Poland in late 1944 noted the unusual number of failures and mishaps, but generally attributed them to the fog of war, to the confusion of a collapsing front, to the inevitable chaos of defeat. A few German officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs mentioned the mysterious mapping problems they had encountered, the sense that their intelligence had been fundamentally compromised, but none of them identified the source or understood the scale of the deception. It wasn't until the 1990s, when Soviet archives began to open after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that researchers stumbled across references to a Polish woman who had sabotaged German cartographic operations. Even then, the information was fragmentary and difficult to verify, scattered across multiple documents with Anna's name sometimes spelled differently or omitted entirely. The full scope of what she had done, the years of careful deception, the network she had built, the operations she had undermined, all of this had to be painstakingly reconstructed from incomplete records and cross-referenced German military reports. By the time historians understood what Anna Pawlik had accomplished, everyone who had known her personally was dead, and the woman herself had been gone for decades. The question of why Anna's story remained unknown for so long reveals something important about how we remember war and resistance. History tends to favor the dramatic and the visible, the acts of resistance that involve explosions and firefights, the heroes who die gloriously, rather than those who survive quietly. Anna's resistance was subtle, bureaucratic, a war fought with pencils and paper rather than guns and grenades. It didn't produce photographs of brave fighters or dramatic moments that could be captured on film. It was invisible by design, effective precisely because it looked like cooperation rather than resistance. Even after liberation, when Anna could have claimed credit for her actions, the very nature of her sabotage made it difficult to prove or quantify. How do you demonstrate that you corrupted maps? How do you show that military failures were caused by your lies rather than by the countless other factors that affect battlefield outcomes? The lack of physical evidence, combined with the secrecy that had been necessary for her survival, meant that Anna's story was easy to overlook, easy to dismiss, easy to forget. She had fought a war that left no scars anyone could see, and so the world assumed she hadn't fought at all. The broader significance of Anna Pawlik's story extends beyond her individual actions to what it reveals about resistance under occupation and the countless forms that courage can take. Every occupied territory and every war has produced people like Anna, individuals who found ways to resist that didn't involve joining organized movements or taking up arms, the clerk who processed documents slowly, the translator who slightly mistranslated critical orders, the factory worker who subtly sabotaged production, the cook who provided less food than requisitioned, the thousands of small acts of resistance that cumulatively had enormous impact, but were never recorded or celebrated, because they were too mundane, too ordinary, too easy to dismiss as insignificant. Anna's story reminds us that war is not just fought on battlefields, but in offices and classrooms and kitchens, that the people who change outcomes are not always the ones holding weapons, and that some of the most effective resistance is the kind that looks like compliance until it's too late for the enemy to respond. Her story also reminds us of the personal cost of this kind of resistance, the loneliness of fighting a war that no one else knows you're fighting, the psychological burden of maintaining a deception for years, the way that effective resistance can look so much like collaboration that even after the war ends, people question which side you were really on. Today, more than 80 years after Anna Pawlik stood in that classroom and began teaching German soldiers to read maps wrong, her story serves as a powerful reminder that history is full of forgotten heroes whose actions shaped events in ways we're still discovering. In an age where we often feel powerless against large systems and institutional forces, Anna's story demonstrates that individual intelligence and courage can have outsized effects, that one person in the right place with the right knowledge and the willingness to take risks can genuinely change outcomes. Her story also warns us about how easily such contributions can be lost, how the people who fight wars in unconventional ways are often written out of history because their methods don't fit our narrative expectations of what resistance looks like. Anna Pawlik deserves to be remembered not just as a war hero, though she was certainly that, but as an example of the complex, unglamorous, psychologically costly reality of resistance under occupation. She was a woman who turned her classroom into a battlefield, her knowledge into a weapon, and her life into a 3-year performance that may have saved countless lives at the cost of her own peace of mind. She asked for no recognition, received no honors, and died in obscurity, but her legacy is written in the confused German military reports, in the failed operations and lost units, in the chaotic retreat that her lies helped create. She won her war even though history forgot she fought it, and that makes her story not just inspiring, but essential. A reminder that the most important battles are sometimes the ones no one knows are being fought until long after they've been won.